The young shepherd stood in the valley of Elah, 5 smooth stones gathered from the brook, a sling in his hand, and the mocking giant Goliath before him. The entire army of Israel watched from the hills, paralysed by fear of this 9-foot champion who had taunted them for 40 days. But David saw what they could not, that the battle belonged to the Lord, that uncircumcised Philistines had no right to defy the armies of the living God, that size and armour meant nothing when divine power entered the field. The stone flew, Goliath fell, and in that moment David's life changed forever. He was perhaps 17 or 18 years old, ruddy-faced and handsome, the youngest of 8 sons from Bethlehem. He had been tending his father's sheep when the prophet Samuel came and anointed him secretly as Israel's future king. That anointing had remained hidden, known only to his family, its fulfillment seemingly distant and uncertain. But the stone that felled Goliath thrust David into the national spotlight with a force as devastating as the impact that killed the giant. King Saul, watching from the ranks of Israel, saw the young man who had accomplished what his entire army could not. That very day, Saul took David into his service, refusing to let him return to his father's house. The shepherd who had killed lions and bears protecting his flock was now to serve in the king's court, his courage and faith recognised, his potential suddenly realised. But David's relationship with Saul's household predated Goliath's death. Months earlier, when an evil spirit from the Lord tormented Saul, divine judgment for his disobedience at Gilgal and Amalek, the king's servants had sought someone skilled with the lyre, whose music might soothe the troubled monarch. They found David in Bethlehem and brought him to court. Saul loved him greatly and made him his armour-bearer. Whenever the evil spirit came upon Saul, David would play and relief would come, the spirit departing and peace temporarily restored. So David inhabited dual roles in Saul's court, musician who brought solace during the king's dark episodes, and increasingly, military commander whose victories brought glory to Israel. After Goliath's death, Saul set David over the men of war, a position the young man handled with such skill that he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Success followed success. The Philistines, instead of being emboldened by their champion's death, found themselves facing a warrior whose courage and tactical brilliance seemed divinely inspired. But it was the people's response that planted the seed of Saul's destruction. As David returned from striking down the Philistine, as the army came back victorious, the women came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. They sang to one another as they celebrated, and their song contained a comparison that would prove fatal. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. The mathematics of the song were damning, thousands versus 10,000s. The king credited with much, the young commander credited with more. It was praise certainly meant a celebration of Israel's victories, but to Saul's ear it was displacement, usurpation, the sound of his own diminishment rising from the throats of his people. The text records Saul's response with devastating simplicity. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day forward. That phrase, eyed David, was more than suspicious observation. It was the concentrated malice of insecurity transformed into hatred, the fixed gaze of paranoia that would pursue David for more than a decade. From that day forward, Saul saw David not as loyal servant but as mortal threat, not as the man who had saved Israel, but as the rival who would take his throne. The next day an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul and he raved within his house. It was one of his episodes, the torment that usually brought David with his lyre. The young musician came and played as he had done many times before, but this time Saul had a spear in his hand. As David played, seeking to bring peace through music, Saul hurled the spear, thinking to pin David to the wall. David evaded it. The spear struck the wall behind him, quivering from the force of the throw. The king who had been soothed by David's music now sought his death. The armour-bearer who had stood ready to serve now stood dodging murder attempts. And this was not momentary madness that passed with the evil spirit's departure. This was calculated intent, the decision to remove the threat David represented. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. The text makes this theological reality explicit. Success in ancient Israel was interpreted through the lens of divine favour. When a man prospered, won battles, gained popular support, the explanation was clear. God was with him. And if God was with David while having departed from Saul, the implications were unmistakable. The anointing had shifted. The kingdom would change hands. Saul responded to this threat not with repentance but with strategy. He removed David from his immediate presence, making him a commander of 1,000, sending him out at the head of troops. It was ostensibly a promotion, but the subtext was clear. Expose him to danger. Let the Philistines accomplish what the spear could not. Yet the plan backfired spectacularly. David went out and came in before the people, and he had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. The contrast was becoming stark. David's success increased Saul's fear rather than diminishing it. Popular support for the young commander grew while Saul's paranoia deepened. The kingdom was dividing in loyalty even while Saul still sat on the throne, and the king understood that time was not on his side. So Saul turned to another strategy, one that would bind David to him through family, while simultaneously exposing him to mortal danger. He offered his daughter Merab as wife, with one condition: only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. It seemed generous. Marry into the royal family, become the king's son-in-law, cement your position in court. But the intent was darker. Saul thought, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. David's response revealed both his humility and his awareness of his own status. Who am I, and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? It was the question of a shepherd from Bethlehem, conscious that he came from obscurity, that his family was not among Israel's elite. But when the time came for Merab to be given to David, Saul gave her instead to Adriel the Maholathite. It was calculated insult, a promise made and withdrawn, another layer of psychological warfare designed to destabilize the young warrior. But then Saul discovered something he could exploit more effectively. His younger daughter Michal loved David. The text makes this explicit. She loved him, a rare statement of a woman's affection in Scripture's typically terse romantic narratives. When Saul learned of this love, he saw opportunity. Let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. The bride price Saul demanded was grotesque, 100 Philistine foreskins. It was calculated cruelty disguised as martial requirement. To obtain 100 foreskins, David would need to kill 100 enemies in combat close enough to take trophies from their bodies. The likelihood of surviving such encounters was low, and that was precisely Saul's intention. Let David die trying to marry Michal, and the threat would be eliminated while Saul's hands remained technically clean. David's response stunned the court. He went out with his men and struck down 200 Philistines, delivering double the required bride price. David brought their foreskins and gave them in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. It was overachievement driven perhaps by love for Michal, perhaps by determination to prove himself, perhaps by the sheer momentum of divine favour that made victory after victory follow in succession. Saul had no choice but to honour his word. He gave Michal his daughter to David as wife. But the marriage that should have solidified David's position in the royal family instead intensified Saul's fear. When Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that Michal loved him, he was even more afraid of David. The alliance had backfired again. Instead of eliminating the threat, Saul had bound his own daughter to the man he feared most. The attempts on David's life became more direct. Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants, commanding them to kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's heir, had become David's closest friend. The bond between them was extraordinary, described in language that suggests covenant relationship deeper than mere political alliance. Jonathan loved David as he loved his own soul. He had stripped off his robe and given it to David, along with his armour, his sword, his bow and his belt. Symbolic transfer of royal position, acknowledgement that David, not Jonathan, would be Israel's next king. Jonathan warned David of his father's intent and interceded on his behalf. He spoke well of David to Saul, reminding him of David's service, of Goliath's death, of the great salvation God had worked through this young warrior. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? The argument temporarily prevailed. Saul listened to Jonathan and swore, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death." Peace returned briefly. David was brought back to Saul's presence as before, the crisis apparently resolved. But it was temporary reprieve, not genuine reconciliation. The evil spirit that tormented Saul was not exorcised, merely dormant. The jealousy that drove the king's rage was not healed, merely suppressed. And when David achieved yet another victory over the Philistines, the cycle repeated. David sat in the house playing the lyre, and Saul had his spear in his hand. It was the same scene as before, music meant to soothe, a king tormented by spirits, a weapon in reach, and once again, Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear. This time the text notes it was the third attempt. Twice before, Saul had thrown the spear while David played. Twice David had evaded death. Now it happened again, the spear hurled with murderous intent, David escaping, the weapon striking the wall. But this time David understood that there would be no more temporary peace. This time the attempt was final evidence that Saul would never stop until David was dead. That night David fled. He would not return to the palace. He would not play the lyre for Saul again. He would not serve in the army he had led to victory. The hero of Israel was about to become its most famous fugitive. Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, the king's daughter who loved David more than she feared her father, warned her husband, "If you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed." She let David down through a window, and he escaped into the night. Then she took an image, a household idol, and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with clothes. When Saul's messengers came in the morning to take David, she said, "He is sick." The deception bought hours. When Saul sent messengers back with orders to bring David in the bed if necessary, that he might be killed, they discovered the idol and realized David had escaped. Saul confronted his daughter. "Why have you deceived me thus and let my enemy go so that he has escaped?" Michal's answer protected herself while implicating David. "He said to me, 'Let me go.' Why should I kill you?" It was a lie, but one that revealed the danger of her position. Caught between father and husband, forced to choose sides in a conflict that would tear the kingdom apart. David was gone. The young man who had arrived at court as a shepherd musician, who had killed a giant, who had led armies to victory, who had married the king's daughter and befriended the king's son, that favoured son, was now running for his life. The palace that had been his home was now his prison had he stayed. The king who had once loved him was now his sworn enemy. The people who sang his praises would not protect him from royal rage. Everything had changed. The stone that killed Goliath had launched David into fame. The spear that missed him in Saul's house launched him into exile. The shepherd who became a hero was now a fugitive, and the wilderness years were beginning, years that would refine his character, test his faith, forge his mighty men, and shape the psalms that would comfort God's people for 3,000 years. But all David knew in that moment was that he was running into the night, leaving behind position, comfort, family, and the certainty of palace life, heading into unknown dangers with only the certainty that the king of Israel wanted him dead and would not stop until he succeeded or died trying. David fled through the darkness, putting distance between himself and Saul's assassins, heading south toward the one man who might understand what was happening, Samuel the prophet. Ramah lay roughly 15 miles from Gibeah, a journey that could be made in a night by a man running for his life. The town was Samuel's home, the place where he had established a company of prophets, where he had judged Israel for decades, where he had first anointed David in secret all those years ago. When David came to Samuel and told him all that Saul had done to him, the old prophet received him without question. They went together to Naioth, a prophetic community within Ramah where Samuel's disciples lived and studied. It was sanctuary, a place where the word of the Lord still held authority, where Saul's reach might be restrained by respect for prophetic office, if nothing else. But Saul learned where David had fled. He sent messengers to Naioth to seize him, ready to violate even prophetic sanctuary if it meant eliminating his rival. What happened next was so bizarre, so supernaturally disruptive to Saul's plans, that it became a proverb in Israel. When the messengers arrived and saw the company of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing as head over them, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's messengers, and they also prophesied. They had come as hunters and became worshippers, their mission forgotten, their weapons dropped, overtaken by divine power that redirected their purpose entirely. Word came back to Saul that his mission had failed, not through David's escape, but through his messengers' transformation. Saul sent more messengers. The same thing happened. They prophesied instead of pursuing. He sent messengers a third time, and again they prophesied. The pattern was clear. God was defending David through supernatural means, making it impossible for Saul's agents to harm the one he had anointed. Finally, Saul went himself to Ramah, rage driving him where prudence should have counselled retreat. He came to the great well that is in Seku and asked where Samuel and David were. When told they were at Naioth, he set out for that place, but the Spirit of God came upon him as well, and he prophesied as he walked, all the way from Seku to Naioth. Then came the most humiliating moment of Saul's pursuit. He stripped off his clothes, his royal garments, the symbols of his office and authority, and prophesied before Samuel. He lay naked all that day and all that night, completely under the Spirit's control, unable to harm David, unable even to maintain his dignity. The king who had hunted David lay prostrate and exposed, a spectacle that would be remembered and questioned for generations. Hence the saying that would circulate throughout Israel, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" It was the second time this phrase had been used about Saul, the first when he prophesied after Samuel initially anointed him, demonstrating divine confirmation of his calling. But this second instance was different. This was not confirmation but containment, not blessing but barrier, God using the same supernatural means to protect David that he had once used to confirm Saul. The contrast could not have been more stark or more humiliating. David escaped from Ramah while Saul lay immobilized. But his situation was more desperate than ever. He could not return to Gibeah. He could not stay with Samuel. The messengers would come again once Saul recovered. His wife Michal was in the palace under her father's authority. His family was vulnerable to Saul's retaliation. He was alone, hunted, with nowhere safe to turn, except Jonathan. David went secretly to find Jonathan, taking enormous risk to see his friend one more time, to understand whether there might still be path to reconciliation, to determine definitively whether Saul's intent was permanent or might yet be changed. When they met, David's anguish poured out in questions that revealed the depth of his confusion and pain. What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father, that he seeks my life? Jonathan, who had interceded successfully before, who had received his father's oath that David would not be killed, initially resisted believing the situation was as dire as David claimed. Far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so. But David knew better. He had evaded 3 murder attempts. He had fled in the night. He had seen the messengers sent to kill him in his own house. Your father knows well that I have found favour in your eyes, and he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. It was not exaggeration, but assessment. David was one mistake, one unlucky moment, one successful ambush away from death. The danger was immediate and existential. Jonathan, confronted with his friend's desperation, yielded, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." They devised a test. The next day was the New Moon Festival, a sacred time when the king's household would feast together. David's absence would be noted. If Saul asked where David was, Jonathan would say he had gone to Bethlehem for his family's annual sacrifice. Saul's response would reveal his true intentions. If he accepted the explanation calmly, David might yet be safe. If he became angry, Jonathan would know that his father was determined to kill David. But they needed a way to communicate the results safely, without David risking capture by coming near the palace. So they arranged an elaborate signal. Jonathan would go to the field where David hid and shoot 3 arrows as though practicing. If he told his servant boy, "Look, the arrows are on this side of you, take them," it would mean safety. David could return. But if he said, "Look, the arrows are beyond you," it would mean danger. David must flee and keep fleeing. The plan required trust in something greater than themselves. Before parting, Jonathan spoke words that revealed the depth of his love and the source of his hope. "Go in peace, because we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever.'" It was covenant renewed, the acknowledgement that whatever happened, their bond transcended immediate circumstances. They were brothers not by blood, but by divine arrangement, linked by something stronger than politics or family loyalty. Jonathan was declaring that even when David became king, and both understood that day was coming, the covenant between them would protect Jonathan's descendants from the purges that typically accompanied dynastic change in the ancient Near East. The New Moon Festival arrived. David did not come. The first day, Saul said nothing. Perhaps David had become ceremonially unclean and could not attend. But on the second day, when David's place remained empty, Saul's patience broke. He asked Jonathan directly, "Why has not the son of Jesse come to the meal, either yesterday or today?" Jonathan delivered the prepared explanation. David had earnestly asked leave to go to Bethlehem for his clan's sacrifice, and Jonathan had granted permission. It was reasonable. It was respectful. It should have been acceptable. Saul's rage exploded. "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame, and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." The insult to Jonathan's mother was gratuitous cruelty, attacking his son through dishonouring his wife. But the substance of Saul's accusation revealed the king's tortured logic. He understood that David threatened Jonathan's succession. As long as David lived, Jonathan would never be king. From Saul's perspective, Jonathan's loyalty to David was suicidal folly, choosing friendship over crown, love over dynasty. But Jonathan saw what his father could not, that David's kingship was God's will, that opposing it was futile rebellion, that protecting David was righteous obedience. He challenged his father directly. Why should he be put to death? What has he done? It was the question David had asked, the question that had no good answer because David had done nothing deserving death. His only crime was being God's anointed, attracting divine favour, succeeding where Saul failed. But questions of justice were irrelevant to Saul now. In response to Jonathan's challenge, the king hurled his spear at his own son, seeking to pin Jonathan to the wall as he had tried to pin David. Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. But the grief went deeper than personal insult. Jonathan now knew with certainty what David had claimed. Saul was determined to kill David, and nothing, not friendship, not reason, not justice, not even familial love, would deter him. The next morning Jonathan went out into the field at the appointed time with a small boy to retrieve his arrows. He shot the arrows far beyond where David hid, then called to the boy, "Is not the arrow beyond you? Hurry! Be quick! Do not stay!" The signal was clear. Danger! Flee! Do not return! The boy gathered the arrows and brought them to his master, knowing nothing of what the words meant. Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and sent him back to the city. Then, when they were alone, David came out from behind the stone heap where he had hidden and fell on his face to the ground, bowing 3 times. The gesture was formal acknowledgement of status, David recognizing Jonathan as king's son, showing deference even in their friendship. They kissed each other and wept together, the text noting that David wept even more than Jonathan. It was grief layered upon grief. David was losing not just position and safety, but his closest friend. Jonathan was losing the man who should have been his rival, but had become his brother. They were being torn apart by circumstances neither controlled, by a father's madness and a divine plan that would not be thwarted. Jonathan spoke the final words of their meeting. "Go in peace, for we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever.'" Then David departed, and Jonathan went into the city. They would see each other only once more before Jonathan's death, and that meeting would be brief, a desperate moment of encouragement in the wilderness. This tearful parting was effectively their farewell. David's flight from Gibeah was now complete. He could never return. Saul's intent was confirmed beyond doubt. Jonathan's intercession had failed permanently. The palace that had been his home, the army he had commanded, the normal life he might have led, all were behind him now, unreachable across a chasm of royal madness. But David needed immediate resources. He had no weapons, no supplies, no food. In his haste to flee, he had taken nothing, and so he went to Nob, a priestly city just a few miles from Jerusalem, where the tabernacle had been set up after Shiloh's destruction. There the priest Ahimelech served, guardian of the sacred things, custodian of Israel's worship. When Ahimelech met David, he came trembling. The king's son-in-law arriving alone without escort was alarming, suggesting either disgrace or secret mission. David chose deception to protect both himself and the priest. "The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place.'" It was a lie born of desperation. David claimed to be on the king's business, that his men were meeting him elsewhere, that everything was normal and official. Ahimelech, reassured, asked how he could help. "Now then, what do you have on hand?" "Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here." The request seemed simple, but Ahimelech's answer revealed a problem. There was no common bread available. The only bread at hand was the bread of the presence, the holy bread that sat before the Lord in the tabernacle, bread reserved exclusively for priests, forbidden to ordinary people under the law. But Ahimelech recognized necessity outweighed ritual. "I will give it to you," he said, "if only the young men have kept themselves from women." The ceremonial purity requirement could be satisfied if David's fictional men had remained clean. David assured him they had, and Ahimelech gave him the holy bread. Centuries later, Jesus would reference this moment when Pharisees criticized his disciples for plucking grain on the Sabbath. "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests?" The point was not that law could be casually dismissed, but that mercy and necessity could supersede ceremonial requirements, that ritual was meant to serve life rather than life-serving ritual. But David needed more than bread. "Is there not here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." The lie continued, urgency explained by fabricated royal mission. Ahimelech's response must have struck David as both ironic and providential. "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah. Behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here." Goliath's sword, the weapon of the giant who had terrorized Israel, taken as trophy after David killed him with a stone, stored in the tabernacle as memorial to God's deliverance. Now David would wield it, the sword of his greatest triumph becoming a weapon of his desperate flight. "There is none like it. Give it to me," David said, and the transaction was complete. He had bread. He had a weapon. He had what he needed to survive a few more days. But someone witnessed the exchange. Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen, was there that day, detained before the Lord, perhaps fulfilling a vow, perhaps ceremonially unclean and waiting for purification. He saw David. He saw Ahimelech give him bread and sword. He heard the explanation about the king's business, and he was Saul's man, loyal to the king who employed him, owing nothing to the priest or the fugitive. David left Nob and continued his flight, but now desperation drove him to a decision that revealed how completely his world had inverted. He went to Achish, king of Gath, seeking refuge in the very city where Goliath had been champion, among the people he had defeated in battle, carrying the sword of their dead hero. It was insanity born of necessity. Israel was no longer safe. Saul's reach extended throughout Judah and Benjamin. Where else could David go but to Saul's enemies, betting that the enemy of his enemy might offer protection? But the servants of Achish recognized him immediately. Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. The song that had provoked Saul's jealousy now endangered David in Philistine territory. He was too famous, too identified with Israel's victories over the Philistines. Achish would kill him not as rival, but as enemy warrior, executioner of countless Philistine soldiers. David took their words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. His response was theatrical and desperate. He changed his behaviour before them and pretended to be insane in their hands. He made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. It was complete humiliation, the hero of Israel reduced to drooling madman, scratching at doorposts, performing madness to escape death. The performance worked. Achish said to his servants, "Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" The contempt in Achish's words was palpable, but so was his dismissal. David was driven away, not executed, rejected as too pathetic to bother killing. David escaped from Gath and went to the cave of Adullam, leaving Philistine territory, returning to Judean wilderness, finding refuge in limestone caves that honeycombed the hills. He was alone, humiliated, marked by fear and desperation. The man who had killed a giant now pretended madness to escape death. The commander who had led armies now hid in caves. The king's son-in-law now lived as fugitive with no resources and no prospects. But while David hid, catastrophe was preparing at Nob. Doeg the Edomite had returned to Saul and reported what he had seen. The priest Ahimelech had given David bread and sword, and had inquired of the Lord for him. It was the latter claim that sealed the priest's fate. Ahimelech had sought divine guidance on David's behalf, implying that David's cause was righteous, that God might bless his flight. Saul summoned Ahimelech and all his father's house, the priests who were at Nob. They came before the king, 85 men who wore the linen ephod, ministers of the Lord who believed they served at the king's pleasure and under divine calling. Saul's accusation was blistering. "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait as at this day?" Ahimelech's defence was straightforward and damning to Saul's paranoia. "And who among all your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard, and honoured in your house? Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No, let not the king impute anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little." It was truth spoken to power, the assertion that David had given no evidence of rebellion, that helping the king's own son-in-law and trusted commander was reasonable, that Ahimelech had acted in good faith with no knowledge of any conspiracy. But truth was irrelevant to Saul's madness. "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." The sentence was pronounced. Saul ordered his guards to turn and kill the priests of the Lord. But the king's servants would not put out their hand to strike the priests. Even in Saul's service, even under direct royal command, they refused to kill the anointed ministers of God. Some lines could not be crossed, some commands could not be obeyed, even at cost of their own lives. But Doeg the Edomite had no such scruples. Saul turned to him. "You turn and strike the priests." And Doeg turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. It was massacre, the slaughter of nearly the entire priestly line at Nob, men whose only crime was helping David in what they thought was royal service. The killing did not stop with the priests. Saul ordered Nob itself put to the sword, men and women, children and infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep. It was the ban, the herem that God had commanded against Israel's enemies, now wielded against an Israelite city, against the Lord's own servants. The destruction was total, complete, a genocide motivated by paranoia. But one priest escaped. Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, fled and joined David in his wilderness refuge. He brought with him the ephod, the priestly garment containing the Urim and Thummim, through which God's will could be inquired. With Abiathar came the means for David to seek divine guidance, the continuation of the priestly line that Saul had tried to extinguish, and living testimony to the cost of helping God's anointed. When Abiathar told David what Saul had done, David's response revealed the weight of guilt he carried. "I knew on that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safe keeping.'" David understood the price of loyalty to him. 85 priests dead because they gave him bread. A city destroyed because they welcomed him. Ahimelech's blood on his conscience because he had lied to protect himself. The cost of being God's anointed was not his alone to bear. Others would pay in blood for helping him, for believing in him, for doing what was right. The flight from Gibeah was complete. David had lost his position, his home, his friend Jonathan, and his innocence. He had gained the knowledge that Saul would kill anyone who helped him, that his very presence brought death to those who showed him mercy. He was fugitive and inadvertent destroyer, anointed king and hunted criminal, man of faith and source of catastrophe. And the wilderness was only beginning. The cave of Adullam sat in the hills southwest of Bethlehem, carved by water through limestone, offering shelter and concealment in equal measure. David found it in his flight from Gath, a refuge where he could hide from both Saul's armies and the Philistines who had nearly discovered his identity. It was dark, remote, defensible, everything a fugitive needed. But it was also lonely, cold, a far cry from the palace chambers where he had once slept, from the army camps where he had commanded thousands. David's brothers heard where he was and came to him, along with all his father's house. The shepherd boy who had been dismissed by his brothers when Samuel came to anoint him, who had been sent back to the sheep while they served in Saul's army, was now the centre around which the family rallied. His father Jesse was old, vulnerable to Saul's retaliation if he remained in Bethlehem. His brothers had families to protect. Coming to David was dangerous, but staying in Judah under Saul's paranoid rule was perhaps more so. But the family that gathered at Adullam was only the beginning. Word spread through Judah that David was there, and something remarkable began to happen. Men came to him, not Israel's elite, not the successful and prosperous, but those who had nothing left to lose. Everyone who was in distress gathered to him. Everyone who was in debt came. Everyone who was bitter in soul joined him. They were the broken, the desperate, the displaced. 400 men who had been crushed by circumstance, by economics, by injustice, by life itself. The text description is unflinching. These were not warriors but refugees, not heroes but failures, not the kind of men who typically formed the core of royal courts or military units. They were distressed, harried by creditors, fleeing from obligations they could not meet. They were in debt, a crushing burden in ancient economy, where debt could lead to slavery, where families could be broken apart and sold to satisfy what was owed. They were bitter in soul, disappointed by life, angry at their circumstances, nursing grievances and wounds that made them dangerous to themselves and others. This was David's army. This was the raw material from which he would forge the mighty men who would eventually capture Jerusalem, defeat the Philistines, and establish his kingdom. But when they first arrived at Adullam, they were simply desperate people seeking a desperate leader, hoping that the man who had killed Goliath might somehow lead them to something better than what they were fleeing. David became their captain. The text is simple about this. He became their leader not through formal appointment but through attraction and necessity. They needed someone to follow. He needed companions, soldiers, witnesses that he was not alone in his rebellion against Saul's madness. The arrangement was mutual survival, but it would become something more. Leadership in the wilderness was different from leadership in Saul's court. David could not rely on royal authority or established hierarchy. He had no treasury to pay wages, no armory to equip troops, no supply lines to provision an army. What he had was his own example, his trust in God, his willingness to share their hardships and risks. He was not king commanding from throne, but captain living in caves, eating when they ate, hiding when they hid, fighting when they fought. The formation of community in Adullam revealed something essential about David's character that the palace years had only hinted at. He did not despise the broken. He did not reject the failures. He took men whom society had discarded and gave them purpose, identity, hope. The shepherd who had protected sheep from lions and bears now shepherded men who were themselves being hunted, giving them the same fierce devotion he had given his father's flocks. But David's family situation required immediate attention. His parents were too old to survive cave life, too vulnerable to remain in Judah where Saul might use them as leverage or targets. So David went to Mizpeh of Moab and spoke to the king. "Please let my father and my mother stay with you, till I know what God will do for me." The choice of Moab was significant. David's great-grandmother Ruth had been a Moabite, the loyal woman who had clung to Naomi and Israel's God. The family connection provided basis for request, and the Moabite king accepted, allowing Jesse and his wife to remain in safety, while David fought for survival. It was acknowledgement that David's situation was temporary, that somehow resolution would come, though its form remained unclear. "Till I know what God will do for me." The phrase captured David's position perfectly. He was in limbo between anointing and throne, between promise and fulfillment, living in the tension of knowing God's plan but not knowing the path. Then God sent the prophet Gad, the first direct prophetic word David had received since fleeing Saul's court. The message was simple but significant. Do not remain in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah. Adullam was in Judah, but the instruction was clear. Don't stay hidden in caves. Return to more accessible territory. Be visible. Be present among your people. David obeyed, moving to the forest of Hereth. It was still wilderness, still providing cover, but closer to population centres, more engaged with the communities he would someday rule. The movement suggested that hiding was not the goal. Survival was necessary, but isolation was not the plan. David needed to remain connected to Judah, to be known, to be available for the role God was preparing him to fill. At Hereth, the first test of David's emerging leadership came. Word reached him that the Philistines were fighting against Keilah and were robbing the threshing floors. Keilah was a fortified city in the lowlands, its harvest being stolen by raiders who understood that armies march on grain as much as courage. The city was Israelite, the people David's own countrymen, and they needed help that Saul's paranoid isolation had made him unable or unwilling to provide. David's men balked at the idea. "Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" Their fear was reasonable. They were fugitives with no official status, no support structure, no guarantee of success. Going to Keilah meant exposing themselves, fighting superior forces, risking capture or death for people who owed them nothing and might betray them to Saul for reward. But David inquired of the Lord through Abiathar's ephod, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" The answer came, "Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah." God's directive was clear, but David's men were still afraid. So David inquired again, seeking reassurance that he could share with his band, "Will you give the Philistines into my hand?" The Lord answered, "Go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." The double inquiry revealed David's leadership style. He sought God's will personally, but he also sought confirmation he could use to encourage those following him. Faith was not solitary mysticism, but communal commitment, leadership that brought others along by sharing the divine word that guided decisions. David and his men, now numbering about 600, increased from the original 400, went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines. They struck them with a great blow, brought away their livestock, and saved the inhabitants of Keilah. It was a victory born of obedience, success that came from inquiring of the Lord rather than trusting human calculation. The distressed, indebted, bitter men proved capable of defeating professional raiders when led by faith rather than fear. But when Saul was told that David had come to Keilah, the paranoid king saw not heroism, but opportunity. God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. The logic was military sound. David had moved from the open wilderness into a walled city. He could be besieged, trapped, forced to surrender or die. Saul called out all his forces for war, to go down to Keilah and besiege David and his men. David learned of Saul's plan, and again inquired of the Lord, this time with heartbreaking directness. "O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah, to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down, as your servant has heard?" The questions revealed David's fear and his faith intertwined. He had saved Keilah from the Philistines, but would gratitude protect him from betrayal? The Lord's answers were brutally honest. He will come down, and then, even more devastating, the men of Keilah will surrender you into his hand. The people David had rescued would hand him over to his enemy. Gratitude was no match for fear, and Saul's army would inspire more terror than David's salvation had inspired loyalty. It was lesson in the fickleness of popular support, in the limits of human gratitude, in the necessity of depending on God's word rather than human promises. David and his men departed from Keilah before Saul arrived, moving back into the wilderness, going wherever they could go. No fixed location, no reliable refuge, just constant movement to stay ahead of pursuit. They went to the strongholds in the wilderness of Ziph, in the hill country. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into Saul's hand. The phrase became the pattern of these years. Saul sought, but God did not give. The king's resources were superior: professional army, national treasury, intelligence network throughout Israel. David had 600 fugitives, caves, and God's protection. By any human calculation, Saul should have caught him within weeks. That the pursuit stretched into years testified not to David's cleverness, but to divine intervention. During this time, something was happening to David that would prove as significant as any military victory. In the caves, in the wilderness, in the constant movement and danger, he was writing. The Psalms that would comfort God's people for 3 millennia were being composed in circumstances of desperate need, prayers wrung from genuine anguish, trust declared in the face of overwhelming fear. Psalm 57 came from this period, its superscription noting it was written when David fled from Saul in the cave. "Be merciful to me, O God. Be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge, till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me." The imagery was vivid, raw, honest. David hid in caves, but his real refuge was God. The shadow of wings suggested both protection and intimacy, not distant deity but covering presence. And the storms of destruction were not abstract theological concept but Saul's armies, the spears that had been thrown, the betrayals that threatened. Psalm 142 bore the same origin. With my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. When my spirit faints within me, you know my way. In the path where I walk they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see. There is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. The loneliness pierced through. No one caring, no refuge remaining. Traps hidden in the path. This was not poetic exaggeration, but literal description of David's daily reality. Yet the psalm did not end in despair. I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison that I may give thanks to your name. Prayer became David's primary weapon. The inquiring of the Lord that directed his military and strategic decisions flowed from this deeper well of constant communion. David was learning to live in God's presence more intimately than he had ever known in the comfort of palace, or the success of military command. The wilderness was stripping away everything he could depend on except God, and in that stripping was being forged a relationship that would define the rest of his life. Psalm 34 came from the humiliation at Gath, when David had feigned madness. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. Even the moment of greatest humiliation, drooling and scratching at gates, pretending insanity to escape death, became material for worship. David saw God's deliverance in his escape, found reason for praise in his survival, transformed degradation into testimony. This was not the sanitized religion of temple liturgy, but raw faith hammered out in crisis, praise emerging from genuine peril. His 600 men were witnessing this. They saw their captain pray before every decision, heard him compose songs of trust when circumstances suggested panic, watched him inquire of the Lord rather than relying solely on military calculation. Leadership by faith rather than merely human wisdom was being modelled daily, and slowly the distressed, indebted, bitter men were being transformed into something more. They were becoming David's mighty men. Not all at once, not through formal training, but through shared hardship, and the example of a leader who trusted God more than circumstance, who sought divine guidance more than human advantage, who remained loyal to the Lord's anointed even when that anointed one was hunting him with murderous intent. The contrast with Saul was becoming stark. Saul consulted no prophets. Samuel had died, and no other prophet came to Gibeah. Saul inquired not of the Lord, but trusted his own paranoia and the counsel of men like Doeg, who confirmed rather than challenged his worst impulses. Saul's court was characterized by fear, servants refusing to kill priests, officers afraid to cross the king, an atmosphere of terror and suspicion. David's camp, for all its physical hardship, had something Saul's palace lacked. The presence of God evidenced through answered prayer, through victories that human calculation could not explain, through protection that no amount of military might could overcome. Abiathar's ephod in David's wilderness was more powerful than all of Saul's armies, because through it came the voice of God directing, protecting, promising that what he had begun he would complete. The cave of Adullam had been meant as temporary refuge, but it became something more, the birthplace of a kingdom that would outlast Saul's, the formation ground for warriors who would become legends, the setting for psalms that would outlive empires. 400 desperate men had come seeking a leader. They found a shepherd who cared for them, as he had cared for his father's sheep, who led them not by coercion, but by example, who shared their dangers and privations while teaching them that true security came not from walls or weapons, but from trust in the God who was David's refuge and strength. The wilderness was harsh, unforgiving, dangerous, but it was also school where character was refined, faith was tested and proven genuine, leadership was learned not from books but from necessity. The distressed became warriors, the indebted found riches in loyalty, the bitter in soul discovered purpose in following a man who himself followed God. And David, the anointed king with no throne, the commander with no official army, the hero who was hunted criminal, was being prepared for kingship not in palace halls but in limestone caves, not through coronation ceremony, but through daily dependence on divine provision, not through wielding royal power, but through learning to wait for God's timing while maintaining faith that the promise would be fulfilled. The cave of Adullam was where the fugitive shepherd began becoming the king God intended. Not yet crowned, not yet recognized, but being shaped, refined, prepared for the day when the running would end and the reign would begin. The wilderness was long, but it was not wasted. Every day of flight was day of formation. Every narrow escape was evidence of providence. Every psalm written in anguish was treasure being laid up for generations yet unborn. God was shaping a king not according to human pattern, but according to divine purpose. And the cave of Adullam, dark and damp and uncomfortable as it was, had become the workshop where that shaping was taking place. The wilderness of Ziph stretched south of Hebron, a desolate landscape of limestone hills and sparse vegetation, where a man could hide but survival required constant vigilance. David and his 600 moved through these badlands, staying in the strongholds, camping in the hill country, always watching the approaches, always ready to flee. Saul sought him there every day, scouring the wilderness with professional troops, but God did not give David into his hand. Yet even in this barren refuge, David discovered that geography could not protect him from human treachery. The Ziphites, inhabitants of the region where David sought shelter, came to Saul at Gibeah with information they knew would please the paranoid king. Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh, on the hill of Hachilah, which is south of Jeshimon? The precision of their intelligence was damning. They knew exactly where David was, could guide Saul's forces directly to him, were willing to betray their own tribesmen to curry favour with the king. Their offer was obsequious, designed to flatter Saul's authority. Now come down, O king, according to all your heart's desire to come down, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. Saul's response revealed how desperate he had become for any sign of loyalty. May you be blessed by the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. It was bitter irony, blessing invoked for those planning betrayal, compassion claimed by a man showing none, the name of the Lord used to sanction pursuit of the Lord's anointed. Saul urged them to greater precision. Go, make yet more sure. Know and see the place where his foot is, and who has seen him there? For it is told me that he is very cunning. See therefore, and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with sure information. The language revealed Saul's frustration. David was cunning, slipping away repeatedly, surviving what should have been fatal situations, protected by a combination of skill and providence that made him nearly impossible to capture. But now, with local guides and specific intelligence, Saul believed his opportunity had come. While the Ziphites plotted with Saul, something remarkable happened in the wilderness. Jonathan, Saul's son, David's closest friend, came secretly to David at Horesh. It was enormous risk. Jonathan was heir to the throne Saul was trying to preserve, should have been united with his father against David. Instead, he came to strengthen David's hand in God. Their conversation would be their last. Jonathan spoke words of prophetic certainty and personal renunciation. Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this. It was acknowledgement of reality that Saul fought against, but Jonathan embraced. David would be king. Jonathan would serve him. The natural order of succession, eldest son inheriting father's throne, would be overturned, and Jonathan accepted this not with bitterness but with faith. He recognized God's choice, submitted to divine purpose, and sought to encourage the man who would displace him. They made a covenant before the Lord, renewing the bond between them, establishing terms that would protect Jonathan and his descendants when David eventually took the throne. Then Jonathan returned to his house, and David remained at Horesh. They would not meet again. Within years, Jonathan would die fighting the Philistines alongside the father, whose madness he had tried to moderate, falling in battle at Mount Gilboa, his loyalty to Saul ultimately costing him his life. But David had no time to process the weight of that final meeting. The Ziphites returned to Saul with updated intelligence, and the king mobilized his forces. David and his men fled to the wilderness of Maon, in the Arabah south of Jeshimon, moving deeper into the desert, seeking terrain so harsh that pursuit would be difficult. Saul came after them. The text describes the pursuit with geographical precision that suggests how close the armies came. Saul and his men went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side. David was making haste to get away from Saul, and Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them. It was the tightest margin yet. The professional army was surrounding the fugitives, moving to encircle them, about to spring the trap. David's 600, however skilled they had become, could not defeat Saul's thousands in open battle. Capture seemed inevitable. Execution would follow. The promise of kingship appeared about to end in the wilderness of Maon. Then a messenger came urgently to Saul. "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land." The timing was providential, the interruption critical. Saul had to choose between pursuing David and defending Israel against foreign invasion. The king's responsibility prevailed over personal vendetta. He turned back from the pursuit and went to meet the Philistines. The place where David had nearly been captured was given a name commemorating the narrow escape, the Rock of Escape. It stood as permanent testimony to how close death had come and how precisely God's deliverance had arrived. David and his men had been on one side of the mountain, Saul and his troops on the other, closing in, and then the Philistine raid forced Saul away, breaking the encirclement at the last possible moment. From Maon, David went to the strongholds of En-Gedi, moving east toward the Dead Sea, finding refuge in the wilderness that stretched from the Judean hills down to the Salt Sea's shores. En-Gedi was a place of wild goats, of cliffs and caves, of springs that created oases in the midst of desolation. The terrain was even more rugged than Ziph or Maon, offering better concealment but harder survival. When Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told that David was in the wilderness of En-Gedi. The king's obsession was undiminished. He took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel, elite troops, the best soldiers available, and went to seek David and his men in front of the Wild Goats Rocks. It was overwhelming force brought against 600 fugitives, professional military power deployed to eliminate one man and his band of misfits. Saul came to the sheepfolds, by the way, where there was a cave. He went in to relieve himself. The text uses euphemism, but the meaning is clear. The king needed privacy for natural necessity, entered a cave alone, his guards remaining outside. What Saul did not know was that David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of that very cave, hidden in darkness, watching as the king who hunted them entered their refuge. The men with David saw opportunity in the coincidence. They whispered urgently, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, 'Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you.'" The temptation was enormous. Saul was alone, vulnerable, completely at their mercy. One thrust of a sword and the persecution would end. The throne would be open. The years of running would be over. David's men were ready. They had lived with the fear and hardship Saul's pursuit caused, had watched friends die, had suffered privation because of this man's jealousy. Justice seemed to demand Saul's death. Opportunity seemed to present it. Divine providence seemed to have arranged it. David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. It was gesture both symbolic and restrained, close enough to kill but choosing merely to take evidence, demonstrating that he could have struck but did not, that Saul's life was in his hand and he had chosen mercy. But even this limited action bothered David's conscience. Afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." The theology was precise and costly. Saul was the Lord's anointed. God had chosen him, Samuel had anointed him, and despite his subsequent rebellion and rejection, the anointing remained. To strike God's anointed was to usurp divine prerogative, to take vengeance that belonged to the Lord, to assume authority to remove what God alone had the right to remove. David would not do it, even when opportunity presented itself, even when his men urged him, even when it seemed God himself had arranged the circumstances. David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. The verbs suggest active restraint. The men wanted to strike. saw the opportunity and the justice of it, but David's authority and theology held them back. It was leadership that demanded obedience to principle, even when emotion and circumstance argued otherwise. Saul rose and left the cave, unaware of how close death had come. David also rose afterward and went out of the cave. Then he called after Saul, "My lord the king!" When Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. The gesture was deliberate. David acknowledged Saul's position even while demonstrating Saul's vulnerability. He called him my lord, showed him deference, treated him as king, even though Saul had forfeited the right to such respect through his persistent attempts at murder. David's speech was both plea and indictment. Why do you listen to the words of men who say, "Behold, David seeks your harm. Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave, and some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed." Then David held up the evidence. "See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it." The term "my father" was both respectful and intimate, acknowledging Saul as king and father-in-law, appealing to relationship that should have prevented this pursuit. The robe fragment was proof positive. David had been close enough to kill, but had chosen not to. The demonstration was undeniable. David continued with theological appeal. "May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you." As the proverb of the ancients says, "Out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you." He was entrusting justice to God, refusing to take personal vengeance even when opportunity presented itself. The proverb he quoted established principle. Wicked acts come from wicked people. Therefore his refusal to strike Saul demonstrated that he himself was not wicked, was not the traitor Saul imagined. Then David asked the question that captured the absurdity of the entire pursuit. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? The metaphors were self-deprecating. A dead dog had no value, no threat, no significance. A flea was impossible to catch, and too insignificant to matter. Why was the king of Israel deploying armies and resources to pursue someone so beneath his notice? The question highlighted the disproportionate nature of Saul's obsession. David concluded with appeal to divine judgment. "May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand." Saul's response was immediate and emotional. He lifted up his voice and wept. Then he said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day." It was confession, acknowledgement of David's righteousness and his own evil, recognition that their positions were reversed. David had the moral high ground, had demonstrated the character that Saul lacked. The king even acknowledged what he had long feared. "And now, behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand." Saul understood. He had known it since the women sang David's praises after Goliath's death, had feared it through every victory David achieved, had raged against it through years of futile pursuit. But now he spoke it aloud. David would be king. The throne would change hands. The dynasty Saul hoped to establish through Jonathan would not materialize. Then Saul made a request that revealed his fear even in his confession. "Swear to me therefore by the Lord that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." It was the standard practice of ancient Near Eastern succession. New kings typically eliminated the previous dynasty to prevent future challenges. Saul wanted David's oath that he would not follow this pattern, that Saul's descendants would survive the transition of power. David swore to him. The oath was given, the promise made. Later, David would seek out Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, and show him kindness for Jonathan's sake, demonstrating that the oath had been sincere. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. The king departed to his palace, but the fugitive remained in the wilderness. And critically, the text does not say David followed Saul home or that reconciliation was achieved. Saul's remorse was real but temporary. His acknowledgement was genuine but not transformative. The tears were sincere but changed nothing. David understood what the casual reader might miss. This was not the first time Saul had wept and confessed. After the incident with the spear thrown at Jonathan, Saul had seemed remorseful. After other confrontations, he had appeared to relent. But the pattern always repeated. Temporary repentance followed by renewed pursuit, confession followed by continued attempts at murder. Saul's problem was not ignorance but character. He knew David was righteous. He knew God was with David. He knew David would be king. He acknowledged all of this in moments of clarity. But knowledge did not transform his heart, and when the evil spirit came upon him again, when jealousy reasserted itself, when fear drove out reason, the pursuit would resume. The encounter at En-Gedi demonstrated something crucial about David's character. He had power and chose not to use it. He had opportunity and refused to take it. He had justification, years of unjust persecution, and still declined vengeance. This was not weakness but strength, not cowardice but profound moral courage. David was being tested, and the test was not primarily about survival, but about character. Would he remain faithful to principle when violation would be easy and seemingly justified? Would he trust God's justice when human justice was within reach? Would he wait for God's timing when seizing the moment was possible? At En-Gedi, David passed the test. He spared Saul's life, demonstrated mercy to his enemy, refused to harm the Lord's anointed regardless of personal cost. The lesson was being learned that would define his kingship. Power must be exercised with restraint. Opportunity does not equal divine sanction, and God's ways are not always human ways. The contrast with Saul was now complete. Saul had been given kingdom and squandered it through disobedience. David was denied kingdom and proved worthy through obedience. Saul wielded power to destroy. David possessed power and chose mercy. Saul pursued personal vendetta. David pursued divine will. The wilderness was refining both men, but in opposite directions. Saul was declining into madness and desperation. David was ascending in character and faith, one throne held by a man losing the right to it. Another throne promised to a man being prepared for it. The pursuit would continue. Saul's confession at En-Gedi would not end his obsession. David's mercy would not prevent future attempts on his life. The wilderness years were not over, but something had been established that could not be taken back. David had proven that when given choice between vengeance and righteousness, between opportunity and obedience, between human wisdom and divine command, he would choose God's way even at enormous personal cost. That was the character God required in a king. That was the heart that made David a man after God's own heart. Not perfection, David had his failures coming, but fundamental orientation toward God's will, even when God's will demanded the hardest possible choice. The fugitive shepherd was becoming the worthy king, one moral test at a time, one act of restraint at a time, one choice to trust God's justice rather than seize human vengeance at a time. The cave at En-Gedi was classroom where the most important lesson was taught: power restrained by principle, opportunity filtered through obedience, victory defined not by defeating enemies, but by remaining faithful to God regardless of cost. And the test would come again. Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, burying him at his home in Ramah. The death of the prophet who had anointed both Saul and David marked the end of an era. Samuel had been judge over Israel for decades, the transitional figure between the period of judges and the establishment of monarchy. He had stood as spiritual authority when kings failed, had rebuked Saul's disobedience, had provided sanctuary for David at Naioth. Now he was gone, and David had lost the prophetic mentor who had recognized God's call on his life when he was still unknown shepherd in Bethlehem. David moved south to the wilderness of Paran, deeper into the harsh country where survival demanded both skill and providence. But the wilderness was not empty of human enterprise. Wealthy landowners ran vast flocks in these marginal lands, employing shepherds who moved with the seasons between wilderness and settled country. One such man was Nabal, whose name meant fool, a designation that would prove prophetically accurate. Nabal was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, wealth that marked him as one of the most prosperous men in the region. His business was in Carmel, a town in the hill country of Judah where shearing season brought considerable economic activity. But Scripture's description of Nabal went beyond his assets. The man was harsh and badly behaved. His wife Abigail, by contrast, was discerning and beautiful. Intelligence and appearance both noted, character and wisdom emphasized before physical attributes. The disparity between husband and wife set the stage for what would follow. It was sheep shearing time in Carmel, the season when accounts were settled and generosity was expected. Landowners who had prospered through the year traditionally shared their wealth with those who had helped them, rewarding shepherds and guards, showing gratitude to neighbours and allies. It was both custom and wisdom. Generosity during shearing season built goodwill that would be needed when future difficulties arose. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. He and his men had been in the wilderness where Nabal's shepherds worked for months, and David knew they had maintained excellent relations with them. His band had provided informal protection, keeping raiders away, preventing theft, serving as mobile security force that allowed Nabal's operation to function safely in dangerous territory. David sent 10 young men with a message carefully crafted to be respectful and reasonable. They were to greet Nabal in David's name and say, "Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favour in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." The message was diplomatic. David called himself Nabal's son, showing deference. He emphasized that his men had not harmed Nabal's shepherds or stolen anything, negative virtue that might not seem impressive until one considered how easily 600 armed men could have taken what they wanted from undefended shepherds. He appealed to the shepherds themselves as witnesses. He noted the feast day, making clear this was a request made during traditional time of generosity. And he asked for whatever was available, not demanding specific amount or extravagant gift. It was reasonable request backed by legitimate service. David's men had essentially provided free security, protecting Nabal's assets for months. A generous response would have been both just payment and a wise investment in continued good relations. Nabal's response was contemptuous. "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" Every word was calculated insult. Who is David? Dismissing the man known throughout Israel as Goliath's killer. Who is the son of Jesse? Refusing even to use David's name, referring to him only by his father. Many servants, breaking away from their masters, calling David a rebel slave, denying his legitimacy, suggesting he was merely runaway who had stolen followers from rightful master. Men who come from I do not know where, pretending ignorance of who David was and what he had done. It was not merely refusal, but deliberate provocation. Nabal could have declined politely. He could have given small gift while pleading limited resources. Instead, he chose maximum disrespect, adding injury to refusal. The young men returned to David and told him all these words. David's response was immediate and furious. "Every man strap on his sword." 400 men girded their swords and followed David, while 200 remained with the baggage. It was full military mobilization, and David's intent was explicit. He swore an oath. God do so to David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. It was vow of total destruction, the promise to eliminate every male in Nabal's household by dawn. After months of exercising restraint with Saul, after refusing to kill the Lord's anointed even when given opportunity, David was now ready to massacre an entire household over an insult and refused gift. The irony was bitter. David had spared the king who tried to murder him, but would slaughter a fool who merely insulted him. One of Nabal's young men, recognizing catastrophe approaching, went to Abigail and told her everything. "Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us both by night and by day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep." The shepherd's testimony confirmed David's account. The band had been a wall, protective barrier between the shepherds and any who would harm them or steal from them. They had made Nabal's business operations possible in dangerous territory. The refused generosity was not charity, but payment owed. The young man continued with urgent warning. "Now therefore know this, and consider what you should do. For harm is determined against our master, and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him." The final characterization was damning. Nabal was worthless, literally son of Belial, a man so impossible to reason with that even his own servants would not try. The household knew their master was a fool whose stubbornness would destroy them all. Their only hope was that his wife might possess the wisdom he lacked. Abigail acted with decisive speed. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 already prepared sheep, 5 seahs of parched grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. She loaded them on donkeys and told her servants, "Go on before me. Behold, I come after you." It was substantial gift, appropriate to the service rendered, the kind of generosity that should have come from Nabal. Critically, she told Nabal nothing. Her husband's foolishness was so complete that consulting him would only have prevented the action that might save them. Sometimes wisdom requires working around rather than through obstinate authority. As Abigail rode her donkey down by a ravine in the mountain, David and his men were coming down toward her, and she met them. The timing was providential. A few minutes later, and David would have reached Nabal's estate before Abigail could intercede. She would have arrived to find massacre already underway, her intervention too late. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before him on her face and bowed to the ground. The gesture was complete submission, acknowledging David's authority, seeking to deflect his rage through humility. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears, and hear the words of your servant." She was taking responsibility that was not hers, placing herself between her household and David's vengeance, offering herself as target to protect others. It was courageous leadership of the kind Nabal had never shown. Then Abigail began one of Scripture's most brilliant speeches, combining wisdom, prophecy, and tactical appeal in words that would save her household and redirect David from sin he would have regretted for life. "Let not my lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." She called her own husband fool, using his name as indictment, acknowledging the justice of David's anger, while explaining that the offence came from man whose character was fundamentally flawed. She continued, "But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my lord, whom you sent." It was explanation, not excuse. If she had known, she would have responded appropriately, but Nabal kept her ignorant of what was happening. Then she shifted to theological ground. "Now then, my lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving yourself with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my lord be as Nabal." The insight was prophetic. Abigail understood that God had sent her to prevent David from sin he would regret. She recognized that killing Nabal's household would be blood guilt, shedding innocent blood that would stain David's conscience and complicate his future. She saw that David was about to save himself with his own hand, taking personal vengeance rather than trusting God's justice, the very thing he had refused to do with Saul but was about to do with Nabal. And she pronounced judgment on Nabal in the same breath as preserving him. Let David's enemies be as Nabal, meaning let God deal with the fool while David remained unstained by his blood. She presented the gifts. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord." It was payment that should have come from Nabal, but came from her instead, acknowledgement of the service David's men had rendered. Then Abigail spoke prophetically about David's future. "Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my lord a sure house, because my lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live." She knew. Somehow this woman, wife of a fool in Carmel, understood that David was God's anointed, that he would be king, that his house would be established. Perhaps the story of his anointing had spread. Perhaps his victories and character had made it obvious. But she spoke with certainty about his divinely appointed future. She continued, "If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God, and the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling." The imagery was vivid and personal, reference to the sling that had killed Goliath, promise that God would protect David as surely as David's stone had found its mark. Her theology was sound. God would preserve David and destroy his enemies. David need not take vengeance himself. Then came the crucial warning. "And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself." She was painting picture of future regret. When David became king, and she spoke of it as certainty, he would look back on this moment. If he slaughtered Nabal's household, that memory would haunt him, would be pangs of conscience that troubled his reign, would be blood guilt that complicated his rule. Better to let God handle justice, to preserve clean conscience, to wait for divine vindication rather than seize human revenge. She concluded with personal request, "And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant." It was not request for reward, but for remembrance, perhaps awareness that her marriage to Nabal could not last, that God's judgment on the fool would come, that when it did, she would need protection and provision. David's response revealed how completely her words had penetrated his rage. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand." He recognized divine intervention. God had sent Abigail to stop him from sin. Her wisdom had saved him from himself. His anger had been righteous. Nabal's insult was real, his ingratitude genuine, but his proposed response would have been sin that he would have regretted forever. David continued, "For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male." It was acknowledgement of how close he'd come to massacre, how near the edge of terrible mistake. Then he accepted her gifts, released her to return in peace, and promised, "Go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition." The crisis was averted. 400 armed men who had been marching to slaughter turned back. The oath of destruction was superseded by oath of peace. Abigail's wisdom had accomplished what force could not. She had changed David's mind, redirected his path, saved her household through words rather than weapons. When Abigail returned to Nabal, she found him holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. He was very drunk, celebrating himself while unaware that his household had been minutes from destruction. Abigail told him nothing until morning. At daybreak, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him what had happened. David's request, his response, the approaching vengeance, her intervention, the gifts given, the disaster averted. Nabal's response was physical and immediate. His heart died within him, and he became as a stone. It was either stroke or heart attack, the realization of how close he had come to death. The shock of discovering that his wife had prevented catastrophe without his knowledge. Perhaps the humiliation of being saved by the woman he had kept ignorant of his business dealings. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. The text is explicit about agency. God killed Nabal. Not David, not disease, not coincidence. The Lord himself executed judgment on the fool who had insulted his anointed and shown contempt for those who deserved gratitude. Abigail's prophetic word had been fulfilled. God had dealt with the enemy. David's hands remained clean. Justice had been accomplished without blood guilt. When David heard that Nabal was dead, his response was immediate worship. Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. It was theological interpretation of events. God had vindicated David, had punished Nabal, had proven that waiting for divine justice rather than seizing human vengeance was right choice. Every element of Abigail's speech had been confirmed. Then David sent to Abigail, proposing marriage. It was not merely attraction to her beauty, though that was mentioned in the text. It was recognition of her wisdom, her faith, her prophetic insight, her courage. She had saved him from sin. She had spoken truth when he was blinded by rage. She understood his calling and his future. She would be asset to his household and his eventual kingship. Abigail's response was immediate acceptance, characterized by continued humility. Behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my lord. She arose quickly, rode on a donkey with 5 young women attending her, and followed David's messengers to become his wife. The transformation was complete. The woman married to fool became wife of future king. The one who had saved David from blood guilt became partner in his life and reign. The discerning beauty who had spoken prophetically about David's future would be there when that future became present. But the story of Abigail and Nabal was more than romantic narrative or demonstration of divine justice. It was test of David's character that he nearly failed, lesson in the danger of righteous anger leading to sinful action, reminder that even anointed leaders need wise counsel to keep them from destruction. David had passed the test with Saul, refusing to kill when he had opportunity, trusting God's justice, waiting for divine timing. But with Nabal, he almost failed. Rage driving him toward massacre, personal offense overriding principle, human vengeance replacing trust in God's judgment. The difference was Abigail. God used her to protect David from himself, to speak wisdom when emotion had overwhelmed reason, to remind him of his calling when anger had clouded his judgment. It was pattern that would repeat throughout David's life. God providing people who would tell him truth, challenge his decisions, redirect him from sin toward righteousness. The wilderness was teaching David that kingship required not just courage and faith, but also humility to receive counsel, wisdom to recognize truth regardless of source, and willingness to change course when shown better way. The lesson was painful but necessary. The king God was preparing needed to know not just how to fight battles, but how to restrain from wrong battles, not just how to execute justice, but how to temper it with mercy, not just how to trust God in persecution, but how to wait for God's timing in vindication. Nabal was dead. Abigail was David's wife. Justice had been accomplished. Blood guilt had been avoided. And David had learned again that God's ways are better than human ways, that waiting for divine justice is wiser than seizing human revenge. That righteous anger must still be filtered through righteous restraint. The wilderness continued to shape the fugitive shepherd into the worthy king. One test at a time, one near failure redeemed at a time, one lesson learned through the wisdom of others at a time. The crown was still future, but the character needed to wear it was being refined through experiences that palace life could never provide. The Ziphites came to Saul a second time, their treachery apparently undiminished by the failure of their first betrayal. They approached the king at Gibeah with the same intelligence they had offered before. Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hachilah, which is on the east of Jeshimon? The location was specific, the information current, the offer to guide Saul's forces implicit in their report. Saul's response demonstrated how completely his obsession had consumed him. Despite the scene at En-Gedi, despite his tears and confession that David was more righteous than he, despite acknowledging that David would surely be king, he rose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David. It was the same force he had mobilized before. Elite troops, overwhelming numbers, professional military power deployed against fugitive band. The pattern was repeating. Temporary remorse gave way to renewed pursuit. Confession did not produce transformation. Saul understood truth about David intellectually, but could not accept it emotionally, could not surrender to it volitionally. The evil spirit that tormented him, the jealousy that drove his rage, the fear that David's success provoked, all these proved stronger than the moments of clarity when truth briefly penetrated his madness. Saul encamped at the hill of Hachilah, by the road on the east of Jeshimon. His army made camp with military precision, establishing perimeter, posting guards, the king's position at the centre where he would be most protected. It was standard procedure, the kind of defensive arrangement that should have made assassination or infiltration impossible. But David was still in the wilderness, and when he learned that Saul had come after him, he sent out spies to confirm it. The intelligence was verified. Saul had indeed come, had established camp, had brought his forces into the wilderness for another attempt at capture. David's response was characteristically bold. He went himself to scout Saul's encampment, observing from concealment, noting the layout, identifying where Saul slept and where Abner, the commander of his army, was positioned. The camp was visible below him, 3,000 men, organized in military precision, fires burning, guards posted, the army of Israel deployed against one of Israel's own. In the centre lay Saul, sleeping within the encampment with his army around him. His spear was stuck in the ground at his head, the weapon that symbolized his royal authority that he had thrown at David repeatedly, now planted beside him as he slept. David spoke to Ahimelech the Hittite, and to Abishai the son of Zeruiah, brother of Joab. Abishai was David's nephew, his sister Zeruiah's son, one of the fierce warriors who had become core of David's band. "Who will go down with me into the camp to Saul?" David asked. Abishai answered immediately, "I will go down with you." It was extraordinary risk. Penetrating an enemy camp at night, approaching the king surrounded by troops, any noise or alarm meaning death. The mission required courage bordering on recklessness. But David had something more than courage. He had the pattern of God's protection demonstrated repeatedly through narrow escapes and providential timing. He was testing again whether God would make way for him, whether divine favour would grant access to the impossible. They came to the camp by night, and there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment, with his spear stuck in the ground at his head. Abner and the army lay around him. The vulnerability was complete. The king, who commanded 3,000 men, slept unguarded, his defenders themselves sleeping, no one awake to challenge the intruders. The text explains what should have been impossible. Now Saul and Abner and all the people were lying asleep because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. It was divine intervention, supernatural unconsciousness that made the camp defenseless. God was arranging circumstances to test David again, to present opportunity that would reveal character, to offer temptation that would demonstrate whether lessons learned at En-Gedi had taken root, or whether vengeance might still be seized when opportunity presented itself. Abishai said to David, "God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice." The logic was compelling. God had clearly arranged this. The deep sleep, the unguarded camp, the spear within reach. Abishai's offer was even more restrained than the urging at En-Gedi. He was not suggesting multiple stab wounds or drawn-out death. One stroke, clean and final, ending the persecution that had consumed years of their lives. He even emphasized efficiency. "I will not strike him twice. One blow would suffice. Saul would die instantly, painlessly. His threat ended forever." But David had learned the lesson. Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? The theology that had restrained him at En-Gedi restrained him again at Hachilah. Saul was still the Lord's anointed. God had chosen him, Samuel had anointed him, and removing him was God's prerogative, not David's right. Then David articulated a theology of divine justice that went beyond mere restraint. As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Three possibilities for Saul's end, all controlled by God. The Lord would strike him, direct divine judgment. His day would come to die, natural death in God's timing. Or he would fall in battle, death through military defeat. But whatever the mechanism, God would determine the timing and method. David would not usurp that divine prerogative. Yet David would take evidence, but take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water and let us go. They were symbols of Saul's authority and vulnerability, the spear representing power, the water jug representing basic human need. Taking them would prove David had been there, had the king at his mercy, and chose not to strike. David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. The text emphasizes that no one saw it, no one knew it, no one awoke. The deep sleep from the Lord remained on the camp, supernatural protection maintaining unconsciousness while David escaped with his proof. They crossed over to the opposite side of the valley, putting distance between themselves and the camp, going to the top of the mountain far away, a great space being between them. The geography was deliberate, close enough to be heard, far enough to be safe, elevated position giving advantage if Saul's forces attempted pursuit. Then David called to the army and to Abner. "Will you not answer, Abner?" His voice carried across the valley, waking the camp, alerting them that something had happened. Abner answered, "Who are you who calls to the king?" David's response was mocking, holding the commander responsible for the security failure. "Are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your lord, the Lord's anointed." It was public humiliation of the army commander, exposing his failure before the troops, demonstrating that the elaborate security had been worthless. Then David provided evidence, and now see where the king's spear is and the jar of water that was at his head. Saul recognized David's voice. "Is this your voice, my son David?" The term "my son" carried weight. Recognition of relationship, acknowledgement of David as son-in-law, perhaps even unconscious admission that David was more worthy successor than his own sons. David answered, "It is my voice, my lord, O king." Then David delivered his plea, more elaborate than at En-gedi, philosophical and theological in equal measure. "Why does my lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands?" It was the fundamental question that Saul had never answered satisfactorily. David had done nothing deserving death. His only offence was being successful, popular, and anointed by God. The pursuit was unjust, irrational, sustained only by Saul's paranoia and jealousy. David continued, "Now therefore let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, 'Go, serve other gods.'" The analysis was penetrating. Either God had stirred Saul against David, in which case sacrifice could atone and relationship could be restored, or men had poisoned Saul's mind with false accusations. If the latter, those men deserved curse because their slander had driven David from his homeland, from the land where the Lord was worshipped, effectively forcing him toward territory where other gods were served. David's final appeal was poignant. "Now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains." The metaphors revealed David's perspective. He was a flea, insignificant, hardly worth the effort to catch. Saul was hunting him like one hunts a partridge, exhausting pursuit of small game, disproportionate effort for minimal reward. And the phrase, "away from the presence of the Lord," revealed David's deepest fear, that he would die in exile, cut off from the land where God's presence dwelt, denied burial among his people. Saul's response echoed his words at En-gedi. "I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly, and have made a great mistake." It was confession again, admission of sin, acknowledgement of foolishness, recognition of David's righteousness. But David had learned not to trust these moments of remorse. He responded not with agreement to return, but with theological observation. "Here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed." David was entrusting vindication to God, declaring that divine justice would reward righteousness and faithfulness, that his refusal to kill Saul demonstrated trust in God's judgment rather than human vengeance. He would not keep the spear as trophy. It would be returned, evidence of David's integrity and Saul's continued authority until God removed it. Then David added, "Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation." It was prayer and statement of equivalence. David had valued Saul's life. Now let the Lord value David's life. The king had failed to protect him. God would have to do what Saul would not. Saul's final words carried prophetic weight. "Blessed are you, my son David. You will do many things and will surely prevail." It was benediction and prophecy combined, acknowledgement that David's success was inevitable, that his triumphs would continue, that the throne was his by divine right. Then comes the devastating conclusion. So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. No reconciliation, no return to court, no restoration of relationship. David went his way, continuing as fugitive, maintaining distance, refusing to trust Saul's momentary clarity, and Saul returned to his place, back to Gibeah, back to paranoia, back to the palace that had become prison of his own making. The parallel with En-Gedi was exact and instructive. Twice David had spared Saul when he could have killed him. Twice Saul had confessed sin and acknowledged David's righteousness. Twice Saul had prophesied David's future kingship. And twice the confession proved temporary, the remorse superficial, the change non-existent. The repetition taught crucial lesson about the difference between intellectual acknowledgement and heart transformation. Saul knew truth. He could articulate it clearly when confronted with evidence of David's mercy. He understood that David was righteous, that God was with him, that his own pursuit was unjust. But knowing did not change him. Confession did not transform him, and moments of clarity did not prevent return to obsessive hatred. The contrast between the two men was now definitive. David was tested twice with same temptation, and passed twice. First in a cave where Saul came unknowingly, then in a camp where Saul slept supernaturally. First cutting robe corner, then taking spear and water jug. First with men urging him to strike, then with nephew offering to strike for him. But both times David refused vengeance, maintained principle, trusted divine justice, honoured the Lord's anointed despite personal cost. Saul was tested twice with same evidence and failed twice. First seeing the robe corner that proved David's mercy, then hearing about the spear and water jug that demonstrated identical restraint. First weeping and confessing, then blessing and prophesying. But both times, confession led nowhere, remorse produced no change, and return to Gibeah meant return to madness. The pattern was established that would define both men's endings. David would be tested repeatedly and would sometimes fail. His sin with Bathsheba still lay in the future. But when confronted, he would repent genuinely, would change behaviour, would accept divine discipline. Saul would be confronted repeatedly and would sometimes confess, but confession would never penetrate to transformation, and he would die still in rebellion against God's will. The spear and the water jug became testimony to character revealed under testing. David's character proved consistent. He would not harm the Lord's anointed regardless of opportunity, provocation, or urging from others. Saul's character proved unchangeable. He would pursue David regardless of conscience, confession, or proof of David's innocence. The wilderness years were drawing toward conclusion, though neither man knew it yet. Saul had perhaps 2 years left before the Philistines would kill him at Mount Gilboa. David's fugitive days were nearly over, though he would make one more desperate decision that would nearly prove fatal. But the lessons of Hachilah were complete. David had proven twice that he would not seize the throne by violence, would not eliminate God's anointed to claim his own anointing, would wait for divine timing regardless of how long that waiting required, or how many opportunities for shortcuts presented themselves. The spear returned to Saul, the water jug went back to the camp, and David continued into the wilderness, still hunted, still homeless, still waiting for God to fulfill promises made when he was young. Shepherd and Samuel poured oil on his head. But he waited with clean conscience, unstained hands, and the certainty that when the throne finally came, it would come through God's action rather than David's violence, through divine timing rather than human impatience, through righteousness maintained under testing rather than expediency seized when opportunity arose. The test was passed, the character was proven, and the fugitive shepherd was one step closer to becoming the worthy king. David looked at the wilderness stretching before him and made a calculation born of exhaustion and despair. Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. It was the reasoning of a man who had endured too much for too long. Twice he had spared Saul, twice Saul had confessed and returned to pursuit. The pattern seemed unbreakable, and David's faith in eventual deliverance was faltering under the weight of years of running. If Israel offered no safety, perhaps its enemies would provide what his own people could not. David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish the son of Maosh, king of Gath. It was the same king before whom David had feigned madness years earlier. But circumstances had changed. David now commanded a substantial force, had a reputation as warrior, represented potential asset rather than pathetic refugee. Achish accepted him, and David lived in Gath with his men, each man with his household, David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. The calculation proved correct. The paranoid king would not pursue David into Philistine territory. But the safety came at enormous cost. David was now living among Israel's traditional enemies, his loyalty suspect to both sides, his position precarious and morally compromised. David said to Achish, "If I have found favour in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" Achish gave him Ziklag, a town in the Negeb that would belong to the kings of Judah from that day forward. David lived in Philistine country 16 months, a year and 4 months of compromise, deception and survival, through methods he would never have employed in Judah. The moral ambiguity of this period was profound. David would raid the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, people south of Judah, enemies of Israel. But he reported to Achish that he was raiding Judah and its allies, making the Philistine king believe David was alienating his own people, becoming permanently hostile to Israel, cementing his loyalty to Gath through burning bridges with his homeland. To maintain the deception, David left no survivors. He struck the land and left neither man nor woman alive, taking away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments. The brutality served pragmatic purpose. Dead men tell no tales. If anyone survived to reach Gath and report that David was actually attacking Israel's enemies rather than Israel itself, the deception would collapse, and David would be executed as traitor to both sides. It was dark period, the fugitive king in waiting, surviving through lies and violence, compromising principles that had sustained him through wilderness years, descending into moral twilight that must have tormented his conscience even as it preserved his life. The man who had refused to kill Saul when given opportunity was now slaughtering entire villages to maintain deception. The shepherd who had trusted God's timing was now taking desperate measures that put him further from the throne he was promised. The situation reached its crisis point when the Philistines gathered their forces for war against Israel. Achish expected David to fight alongside him. "Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army." David's response was deliberately ambiguous. "Very well. You shall know what your servant can do." It could mean eager compliance or veiled warning, commitment or threat. Achish interpreted it positively. making David his bodyguard for life. But David was trapped. If he fought against Israel, he would be traitor attacking his own people, destroying any chance of ever claiming the throne. If he refused, he would be executed as disloyal mercenary who had deceived his Philistine patrons. If he fought but deliberately failed, both sides would recognize his duplicity. There was no good option, no escape from the trap his own choices had created. God's providence intervened through Philistine commanders who did not trust David. As the armies assembled, they protested to Achish, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" The king's explanation, that David had been with him for days and years, that he had found no fault in him since his defection, did not satisfy them. "Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here?" They remembered the song, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. They understood David's reputation was built on killing Philistines. Trusting him in battle against Israel was insanity. Better to send him away than risk his defection at critical moment. Achish summoned David and told him to return to Ziklag. David protested, maintaining the deception to the end, but was overruled. The Philistine commander's distrust saved David from the impossible choice, extracting him from his own trap through their suspicion of his loyalty. David and his men set out early to return to Ziklag. It was a 3-day journey, and as they approached the town on the 3rd day, they saw smoke rising. When they entered Ziklag, they found it burned with fire. The Amalekites had raided the Negeb, and Ziklag had overcome it, burned it, and taken captive all the women and children. They had not killed anyone, but had carried them all away as slaves. David and his men raised their voices and wept until they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam and Abigail. Every man's family had been carried away. Everything they had built during 16 months in Ziklag was destroyed. And the text adds the most devastating detail. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. It was David's lowest point. His family was captured. His home was destroyed. His men, who had followed him for years through wilderness and exile, were ready to kill him, holding him responsible for the disaster. He had no allies, no resources, no options. Everything had collapsed simultaneously. The compromises that had seemed necessary for survival had led to catastrophe. The deceptions that had protected him had left him vulnerable. The desperate flight to Philistine territory had resulted in losing everything that mattered. But then comes the phrase that defines David's character and explains his eventual triumph. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Not in his own courage, not in his military skill, not in his 600 men who wanted to stone him. David strengthened himself in the Lord. In the moment of absolute crisis, when human resources were exhausted and circumstances were utterly hopeless, David turned back to the foundation that had sustained him through all the wilderness years. Trust in God's faithfulness, confidence in divine power, reliance on the covenant relationship that circumstances could not sever. He called for Abiathar the priest and the ephod. He inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them?" It was returned to the pattern that had guided him before Philistine compromise, seeking God's direction, waiting for divine answer, moving forward in obedience rather than desperation. The Lord answered, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue." The certainty was absolute, not perhaps or possibly, but surely. God guaranteed both overtaking and rescue, transforming impossible situation into promised victory through single prophetic word. David and his 600 men set out in pursuit. They came to the brook Besor, where 200 men were too exhausted to continue. David left them with the baggage and pressed on with 400. They found an Egyptian in the field, abandoned by his Amalekite master when he became sick 3 days earlier. David gave him food and water, and the man's strength returned. Then David asked, "To whom do you belong? And where are you from?" The man's answer was providential. I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite. My master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negeb of the Cherethites, and against that which belongs to Judah, and against the Negeb of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. David's question was urgent. Will you take me down to this band? The Egyptian agreed, contingent on oath that David would not kill him or hand him back to his master. He led David to the Amalekite camp, where they found the raiders spread out over all the land, eating and drinking and celebrating their plunder. David attacked from twilight until the evening of the next day. The battle lasted 24 hours, systematic destruction of an enemy caught in drunken revelry. Only 400 young men escaped on camels. Everything else David recovered, all the people, all the livestock, all the plunder. The text emphasizes totality. David recovered all. His 2 wives, every man's family, all their possessions, plus additional spoil from the Amalekite raids. Nothing was missing, small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything they had taken. David brought back all. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, so clearly supernatural that it reversed everything. The men who had wanted to stone David now followed him in triumph. The disaster that had seemed to end his story became testimony to divine faithfulness. The lowest point became launching pad for restoration. When David returned to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to continue, some of David's men, called worthless fellows, said they should receive no share of the spoil since they had not fought. David's response established principle that would govern his kingdom. You shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. It was justice and generosity combined, recognition that victory came from God rather than human effort, that those who supported made possible the fighting of those who engaged. The principle became statute and rule in Israel from that day forward. David sent portions of the spoil to the elders throughout Judah, to friends and allies who had helped him during wilderness years. It was political wisdom, rebuilding relationships, demonstrating generosity, preparing the groundwork for eventual kingship. But it was also gratitude, repayment of debts, sharing blessing with those who had shared his burdens. While David achieved this victory at Ziklag, Saul and his sons fought the Philistines at Mount Gilboa. The battle went badly against Israel. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons and struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded. Saul said to his armour-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But the armour-bearer would not, so Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. When the armour-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armour-bearer, and all his men on that same day. The king who had spent years pursuing David died fighting Israel's enemies. Jonathan, who had loved David and protected him, who had recognized his kingship and made covenant with him, died alongside the father whose madness he had tried to moderate. The wilderness years were over. Not because David had seized the throne, but because God had removed Saul in his own timing, through circumstances David had not orchestrated, by means David could not have predicted. Everything David had refused to do, kill the Lord's anointed, take the kingdom by force, eliminate the obstacle between him and the throne, God had accomplished while David was recovering his family from Amalekite raiders. The legacy of David's wilderness years was not measured in military victories or political achievements, but in character formed under extreme testing. He had learned to wait for God's timing rather than seize opportunities. He had learned that righteous anger must be filtered through righteous restraint. He had learned that power must be exercised with principle. He had learned that God's ways are better than human ways, that divine justice is more reliable than personal vengeance, that obedience to God matters more than expediency or survival. The Psalms written during these years became permanent testimony to faith refined through suffering. Prayer as primary weapon. God as refuge when all other refuges failed. Trust declared in the face of overwhelming fear. worship emerging from genuine peril. These were not academic exercises in theology, but raw expressions of dependence on God when circumstances suggested abandonment. The men who followed David through the wilderness, distressed, indebted, bitter in soul when they arrived, had become the mighty men who would help him establish his kingdom. The caves that had hidden fugitives had become classrooms where character was formed. The desperate decisions and narrow escapes had become education in divine providence. The years that seemed wasted had become preparation that palace life could never provide. David's wilderness ended not with a crown, but with a man prepared to wear one. Not with immediate ascension to throne, but with character proven under testing. Not with armies conquered, but with integrity maintained, faith sustained, righteousness preserved despite every pressure to compromise. The shepherd who had killed a giant became the fugitive who spared a king, became the leader who trusted God, became the warrior who recovered, all became the king, who would rule with justice because he had learned mercy in the wilderness, who would write psalms of faith because he had prayed them in caves, who would build a kingdom that would endure because he had learned that God's timing is perfect, God's ways are higher, and God's faithfulness never fails. The wilderness was harsh, but it was not wasted. The fugitive years were long, but they were not lost. The testing was severe, but it was not pointless. Every day of flight was formation. Every narrow escape was evidence of providence. Every test passed was preparation for greater responsibility. The wilderness closed not with coronation, but with vindication, not with crown placed, but with character proven, not with throne claimed, but with trust validated. The shepherd who had been anointed in Bethlehem was ready to be king in Jerusalem, and the wilderness that had refined him would stand as testimony that the greatest leaders are not formed in palaces, but in places where dependence on God is not optional but essential, where faith is not theoretical but desperate, where the only resource left is the faithfulness of the God who called them, anointed them, and promised to establish them in his perfect timing. David's wilderness ended, but its legacy would endure for eternity.